Hello, welcome to the ALEX webinar, Update on the RDA 3R project. I'm Matt Montgomery from the College of San Mateo. I am a member of ALEX Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Kathy Glennan. Kathy has over 30 years of experience cataloging music and is currently head of original and special collections cataloging at the University of Maryland. She is active in the Music Library Association, the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, and ALEX. She has served as both a liaison and a voting member of CCDA. Since 2005, Kathy's professional contributions have focused on RDA development. She became the ALA representative to the RDA Steering Committee in 2013. There are a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. All attendees are muted. If you have questions for Kathy, please type them into the question box on your screen and she will answer them at the end of the presentation. Our software does not have interactive chat capabilities. You may use the ALEX hashtag if you wish to use Twitter to comment on today's presentation. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so please use the question box to submit questions and comments. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and the presentation slides. And now, here's Kathy. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Thank you, Matt. I hope all of you should be able to see my screen. This is an update on the RDA 3R project, which is in progress. And so I will be giving you my best understanding of what is going on right now, but some of this is subject to change simply because it is an evolving situation. So what is the RDA 3R project anyway? Well, it stands for the RDA Toolkit Restructure and Redesign project. Initial work on this started in the summer of 2016, which began working with standardizing some of the language used in relationship designators and scope notes and other things like that to bring some normalization to how those were presented. It also started introducing some terms from the IFLA Library Reference Model, such as agent. After the changes to from the proposals coming from the RDA Steering Committee meeting in 2016, the toolkit content was frozen in the English language starting in April 2017, and it will remain frozen through the end of the project. This is so that we have a stable text to work with. There's a lot of shuffling going on here, and we wanted to make sure we were not introducing additional changes that we didn't really know about. And we also needed everyone's energy to be focused on the 3R project and not on making other corrections to RDA at the same time. In the end, we will have a new RDA toolkit. Its look and feel will be quite different from what you experience right now. But it's not considered a second edition of RDA because much of the content will remain the same. It might not be in the same place, but for the most part, something that you do right now will be available to you in the new toolkit. I conceptualized this myself in thinking about the changes, say, from AACR2 to RDA. Most of those instructions were still there, but they weren't necessarily in the same order or the same location. But if there was a reason to record a piece of information in AACR2, that reason was still valid in RDA. Now, while it's not a different cataloging code, the same general principle applies. If you could do it before, you should be able to do it now. There may be a few exceptions, but generally that's the idea. The other thing is that there will be much more personalization available in the new RDA toolkit. This is available both at the institutional level and at your own level. You can set up things to work the way you want them to. The product will be coming in June 2018. The announced release date is June 13th. And there's an additional rollout by early September. The June release should include the English language and hopefully one or more translations. The September should include some additional translated texts. ALA Publishing is committed to keeping the old version of the toolkit available for at least another year after the rollout of the new toolkit. But there's one major caveat here. That is still the old, frozen, unupdated RDA toolkit that we're dealing with right now. So anything that you really like about the new toolkit, including perhaps some new instructions or some clarity or new entities, those all will not be applied to the old version of the toolkit. That will just be a static product. Why is this being made available? Well, because with the amount of changes that we're seeing just in terms of look and feel, we understand that people will need to get familiar with it. There need to be time for training. And because of some of the reorganization of the instructions, there will be a need to update policy statements, local decisions, documentation that you've created in your own libraries. So that is going to be part of why the toolkit is available for a longer time in the old version. Whatever you mean by official implementation will be sometime after that June release date. And the reason I say whatever you mean by official, I'm sure some of us will be waiting to see what the Program for Cooperative Cataloging or the Library of Congress says that they're doing. But you might decide in your own institution that you're ready to go and that there's no reason to hold back. So that's one of the things that will be yet to be determined. I should mention that with this release date being in mid-June, there will be related programming at ALA Annual in New Orleans about the RDA Toolkit. For example, I anticipate that there will be a full-day pre-conference. There will certainly be other meetings, the RDA Forum and other things. So if you have an opportunity to attend ALA Annual and you're interested in this, I encourage you to keep your eye open for these offerings. Let's take a look at the first of those R's, well, maybe the second, redesign. The idea here is to create an interactive web-based product. ALA Publishing is working with the user experience firm, and their redesign is based on user stories put forward from the ALA Publishing 3R user group. I'm sure you all have wish lists of things that you, if you were redesigning the toolkit right now, that you would say, please do this. One of them is getting rid of all that white space with the indentations for the instructions as you go down the hierarchy. And that is, in fact, going away. And also, you'll be not only because of that, but people also wanted more relevant information on each screen, including being able to see those policy statements and the instructions at the same time in the same window, instead of having, say, two browser windows open or toggling back and forth between the Resources tab and the RDA tab. These will actually be available at the same time. At your choice, you can suppress them from view or show them. But when the policy statements are showing, they will be anchored to the text that they apply to. So if it applies to the third paragraph in the instruction, that's where you will see it. And you can choose which policy statements you want to see. And we won't have any more of those little colored buttons representing each of the different policy statements. You can set up in your personalization which ones you want to see. There will also be a wider variety of examples, and you can choose which of these to display as a default, and you can override that default in an individual situation. There will be new ways to navigate through the instructions in the chapters that make this much more of a web-based rather than ebook-based experience. And we are introducing more consistency in wording across the instructions. This process started in 2016, but as we are looking at the text more closely now, we're finding others. This is a big advantage for English-speaking users because some of those subtle differences were just simply subtle differences with no meaning. But once you start seeing differences in things that you think should be the same, you might think that there's a hidden meaning behind that. So we're going to get rid of that problem. And then the more consistency in wording also helps with our translations, that you translate a phrase once and then it's used wherever appropriate, and they aren't confused about the hidden meaning behind these minor differences as well. I would like to share with you the sample, and I emphasize the word sample, navigation screenshots. There are two of them here on this page. On the left-hand side is the drop-down menu for the entity chapters. Imagine this blue section being at the top left-hand corner of your toolkit screen when you come in, and you can see that there are drop-downs for the entities by each IFLA Library Reference Model entity. One change that is different from this that I'm aware of is that they will be in the same order as they are in IFLA LRM. So Nomen won't be at the bottom. But you can see this is one way to navigate through. You want to know something about item entity in this case, you can use the drop-down menu to get to that instruction. You see there are three other tabs here. Guidance is for the new general chapter on guidance, another set of instructions. It's not just one chapter, sorry, it's multiple chapters. Then there's also policies. This would be if you know you want to go to a particular policy and you don't want to see it associated with the instructions for some reason. And the Resources tab will function very much like the Resources tab functions right now in the toolkit. And this will include things like AACR2, which will still be part of the new toolkit, and books of the Bible and other things like that. On the right-hand side, you see this new visual browser that will be displaying with each of the entity chapters in the upper right-hand corner. In this case, this is designed for the sound characteristics instructions, and I can see that it is part of a manifestation by going up that tree, and I can see that there are 8 sub-elements that are available for me to find out more, and I can navigate to those simply by clicking on playing speed or playback channels. Also new to the toolkit and not shown here is an element reference or ready reference button that will expand to provide brief facts about the element when you're within certain instructions. The final R in the 3R project is about restructure. And this is that there's under the hood changes going on to make updating and maintenance easier of the toolkit, and also that enables us to break apart chapters and put them back together in other arrangements, which is one of the things that's going on as well. This under the hood work now will ensure that the same content is available for all the flavors of RDA, and that includes the open metadata registry, RDA terms that are there, the RDA vocabularies, the RDA registry, RIMF, or RDA in many metadata formats, a training tool that some of you may have used, and of course the RDA Toolkit. In the past, changes had to be made in multiple locations to get the same results, both in the open metadata registry and in the toolkit. In this new workflow, they are made one place in the open metadata registry and then flow out to all of those other products. And those other products are used by different people: catalogers, obviously, trainers, developers, linked data experts, applications, all sorts of things. The only one of these that is behind a paywall right now is the RDA Toolkit. So what you pay for is the enhanced version of what's going on with the 3R project. But if you need the linked data information, it is freely available. This under the hood work also offers more robust support for translations, and that's really important. The RDA board wants RDA to be a global standard, and the full instruction set has already been translated into 8 languages. The terms in the open metadata registry have already been translated into 8 additional languages, and there are 4 more in progress for that. So it's really important to have all of this working together so that the translations can be close to being current with the base RDA text, instead of right now, sometimes it's a year or more out of date. With all of that said, I'm sure you want to know what's the same. Well, as I mentioned, most of the instructions have been retained, but they will be relocated and reorganized. And I have to warn you that maybe there will be no more instruction numbers. As you saw from the visual browser, there will be different ways to navigate than we have right now. And there's less of an obvious order when you start breaking these entity chapters into their LRM components, and you have general guidance chapters. We're hoping that there won't be as much of a need for instruction numbers, that the navigation will definitely not be through the current chapter drop-down stuff that you get in the left-hand column of the toolkit now. I think maybe the most important reason for instruction numbers is cataloger shorthand, so we all know what we're talking about. And I would hate to see that disappear. Yet I know we all are resourceful people, and I'm sure that if there are no instruction numbers, we will still find a way to refer to these things in a shorthand way. In addition, reasons for recording a particular piece of information may change because of the underlying model changes. And this includes placement at a different place in the work, expression manifestation, or item stack. It's not that you wouldn't record it, it's that the reasons for recording it might change, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Overall, this should not have a significant impact on the creation of MARC 21 records because MARC 21 is an imperfect way of implementing RDA in the first place. That's not changing, even though some of the things that RDA is doing will change. There will be some exceptions, of course, but for the most part, your MARC records won't be substantially different. In the end, there will be more flexibility in choosing how to record a particular piece of information. And this is because RDA needs to accommodate our cataloging in the environment where we find ourselves now, but also look to the future, which is beyond MARC. So by having multiple ways of recording a piece of information, this will enable RDA implementation outside of MARC, say in linked data environments. So what's different? Well, as you've seen, there are two primary sections, each with multiple chapters. The entities chapter, we saw the drop-down menu there, and they will all share a similar structure. Start with a definition, then there'll be recording instructions, guidance for each of the recording methods with integrated examples, and then options and other guidance as appropriate. Then there's the general guidance chapters, which I'll explain a little bit more in another slide. Then there are the changes deriving from the IFLA Library Reference Model, or LRM. There are new entity chapters that will need to be created because they're new entities in LRM. And as many of you know, LRM changed the definition of person, and RDA needs to respond. There will be more and better examples and a variety of example types. And I should also warn you that there will be no more appendices. Not that that stuff is going away, it will just move somewhere else. It might be in a general guidance chapter, or it might be in the resources tab if it only applies to an English language implementation of RDA. So we're not getting rid of anything, but again, it might not be exactly where you expect to find it. Let's take a closer look at the new chapters in RDA. The general chapters will not surprisingly start with an introduction. Then there will be a chapter for the user tasks that are derived from IFLA LRM. There will be a set of chapters relating to pre-cataloging decisions. And as you can see from the things I've listed here, these are drawing on existing RDA instructions. We've just never labeled them as pre-cataloging decisions. And yet, that's really the first thing I have to do when I'm sitting down to catalog something. Am I going to give this a comprehensive description or an analytic description? How does the mode of issuance play into what I'm going to be doing here? I have a facsimile. Wait, how do I deal with that? So all of these are pre-cataloging decisions, and there will be some things that may be new here as well, but why not label them for what they are? There will also be a chapter on provenance. This is in a general form without very specific instructions at this point. This is not meant in its custodial history sense, but more in its linked data sense about who, when, and why a particular metadata statement was asserted. Then there's sources of information. Most of you are familiar with this as appearing rather constantly in RDA instructions about whether you take the preferred source from the title page or if it's any source or any number of variations here. The RSC decided that sources of information should be a general instruction with very broad guidance saying that not only do you need to identify your source of information or the provenance, but that it can be flexible. So provenance and sources of information should work in tandem. So not only did I take this from the title page, but I'm telling you I took this from the title page. Now we recognize that certain communities will want more specific guidance for this, and that's fine. That's what local policy statements, the LCPCCPSs or some other guidance can go into more detail about this. But in general, there will be more flexibility about sources of information. You just have to say where you took the information from. There will also be a chapter about recording methods. Many of you who've been to previous presentations on RDA in the last couple of years have heard about the fourfold path. This is a renaming of that idea, partly to say exactly what it is, because the fourfold path was sort of opaque in how it presented what it was, and also that although In almost all cases, 4 paths will be available. That is not always the case, and having an interactive toolkit which says, look at the 4-fold path, and then only having one example show up might be confusing. So it's been renamed for 2 reasons. And finally, there will be guidance on aggregates, always complex, and that's something I'll spend a fair amount of time on later in this presentation. So let's take a look at recording methods. The entity chapters will present 4 methods for capturing data, and this affects both the instructions and the examples. 2 of these are descriptions, and 2 of these are identifiers. So let's start with the descriptions. We do this right now. Unstructured description is when I transcribe a title and statement of responsibility, or make a note, or even make a note that I think only catalogers are interested in. A structured description is when I take pieces of information and put it in a particular order. So publication statements and access points fall into this category. In terms of retrieval, structured descriptions can bring things together because we have data in a particular pattern that can be applied and related things can be brought together. Unstructured descriptions, however, are really only available for keyword indexing. That's not worthless, but it's also not really very actionable. In terms of the other 2, they are identifiers. There's the general identifier, which includes an ISBN, an ISSN, a music publisher number. In an ideal world, these are assigned by an agency following a pattern and are unique within that agency. Now, we all know that there are examples when that uniqueness is not true, like when publishers assign the same ISBN to 2 completely different books. But the theory is that they are unique within the agency, but certainly not among agencies. And finally, there's the IRI, the Internationalized Resource Identifier, which includes URIs. And this is globally unique and designed for linked data access. Now, as promised, aggregates. Let's talk a little bit about what an aggregating work is. It is actually a plan. It's a plan for bringing together distinct expressions into one or more manifestations. The aggregating work is not the result of doing that. It's not the content. It is the plan. So if you need to find the creator of the aggregating work, it's the person who identified or created the plan. Things like, I'm going to bring together my favorite poems and publish them in 1 volume. Or when our firm publishes this novel, we will add illustrations, or even a plan to create a quarterly cataloging journal and publish it maybe forever because, you guys are out there. Now for static works, or one that's realized and embodied at the same time, that plan can generally be ignored. We just catalog the results. And that's what we do right now. We just have this thing in front of us. It doesn't really matter how the plan came together. There it is. Catalog the results. But for a yet to be complete work, the plan takes on more importance. And actually, we're cataloging those too. When we catalog an open-ended serial or an incomplete monographic set and start making assertions about how many volumes are going to be in this monographic set or how often the serial is going to be published, we're actually describing the plan. So all of these aggregating works are then realized in aggregating expressions, which are embodied as the selection, sequence, and wrapping of the separate expressions. IFLA LRM presents 3 different types of aggregate manifestations, and the RDA Steering Committee has endorsed these. The first of these are collections of expressions. These are when you have more than one distinct work or expression. They've usually been grouped together because they're similar in type or genre. None are considered subordinate to the others. And so some examples are an anthology, such as a Treasury of Great Mysteries, the issue of a journal, like the most recent American Libraries, or a compilation CD, performances of Glenn Miller and his orchestra, with a dozen or so selections. Then there are augmentations. This is when there's one main work or expression with at least one other work or expression that supplements it. That additional work or expression may or may not be significant enough to warrant distinct bibliographic identification. And that decision may vary based on the cataloging agency. If I'm in a very specialized collection, I may wish to go into great detail about these supplementary works or expressions that accompany the main work. If I'm in a general collection, I might not care at all. And what exactly do we mean by distinct bibliographic identification anyway? It could simply be an unstructured description, a statement of responsibility or a note. It could be an authorized access point. It could be a linked data identifier, an IRI. It all depends on your situation. So some examples here: an introduction not by the author, The Birth of NASA, The Diary of T. Keith Glennan, with an introduction by Roger D. Lanius. An index. The final volume in the Complete Poetical Works of Lord Byron has a multi-hundred-page general index by Carol B. Pearson. She's credited on the index. Maybe that's important to you. Or maybe you have a text like Little Women, illustrated by Louis Jambord. And as you can see, this is but one way to bring out those bibliographic relationships and identifications. And finally, there are parallel expressions. This is when you have more than one distinct language expression of the same work. So examples include a publication that's conceived as being bilingual from the start. Think of Canadian government publications or something from the United Nations. In this particular case, the Retirement Income Recent Developments and Proposals has text in English and French on inverted pages. Or there are things that have become parallel because there's the original language and a translation. In this case, Orations by Aelius Aristides with parallel texts in Greek and English. And finally, well, a DVD with a choice of spoken and or subtitle languages is considered parallel expressions. In this case, Holy Hell, held by the University of Maryland, in this particular case has 16 different subtitle choices, as you can see here. That's a lot of parallel expressions in a single manifestation. Well, with aggregates, we also need to understand when we have a new version that creates a new work, or if we have something that is just a new expression. If you have a static work, a new manifestation is a new aggregating work if the content changes. And this you'd see with different expressions. So if I have the same musical work, say the first 3 symphonies of Beethoven in a single aggregate, and then I get another recording of that with completely different performers, even though it's the same work, it is a completely different expression. And then it's really a new aggregating work as well. Also, if another work is added, you have a new aggregating work. So I have a CD that's 10 years old and a new one comes out, same content, but there are 3 bonus tracks. This is technically a new aggregating work. There may be some decisions at the local level whether you decide that that's important enough to bring out or not, but from a model standpoint, it is a new aggregating work. Note that with a static work, if the carrier changes and that's the only change, you don't have a new aggregating work. So if I have an anthology in print and then it comes out as an e-resource and none of the content changes, then it's just simply a new expression of the same aggregating work. Now, if there's a work with content that's added over time, if the plan changes, you have a new aggregating work. And that plan change could take the form of frequency, content type, language, and maybe even carrier type. How you decide which one of these triggers a new work decision is going to be based on local policy. I expect that this is one of the areas where the Program for Cooperative Cataloging will be spending some time, because I know serials catalogers are not excited by the prospect of creating new works every time the frequency changes for an ongoing serial. But that will be at a policy level, not at the RDA level. Note that you don't have a new aggregating work when only new content is added to one of these things, because that's the whole plan. The whole plan of an ongoing work is that you will keep adding content. This leads to a new concept that I believe will be in the new toolkit, and that's of a diachronic work. This is something that's planned to be embodied over time. The work itself changes over time, and that can happen in one of 2 ways, either with revision and replacement in a single expression, think of the old loose leaf for updating kind of volumes, or additions and accumulations in successive expressions where the previous content is retained but added onto in discrete segments that are identified that way. This means that RDA will be adding new categories to support this. And you can see perhaps that this is also going to affect the mode of issuance instructions, which will need to be reworked in this light. The new categories will be for integrating monographic work and sequential monographic work, integrating continuing work and serial work, which really is a sequential continuing work. RDA will also add a category for static work. So there are three aspects of diachronic works that are worth considering. The first is extension of the content. And that is whether, when you're all done, if it needs to be complete as a set or not. If the extension is not completed, the whole work loses integrity, then this is essential. And you can think of that as a multi-volume dictionary where the last volume never gets published. That probably isn't the best dictionary you own. Inessential would be when the extension terminates, the cumulative issued parts are unaffected, it just stopped. Now, the RSC decided that this concept in particular did not need to get into the instructions in RDA because this really isn't about cataloging. When we start cataloging a diachronic work, we don't have the complete thing. If we have the complete thing, we can catalog it as a static work. So it's not really a cataloging decision. We're going to catalog the plan or the information about what we think we're getting based on what we have. But it is important from a collection management standpoint. 10 years down the road, you might decide to toss that dictionary that's not complete because how useful is it anyway? I have some examples coming up. I have included this aspect in these examples just so you can see some of the differences. But again, this won't be part of RDA. The extension mode we talked about already, whether the added content is integrated into the whole or is in successive releases of new content. And then there's the termination of the content, whether you know it or you don't. So let's take a look at some examples. First is an essential integration and determinant work. This would look something like a kit with pieces issued monthly to be assembled into a model. Now you can see that to get my complete R2D2, I need all of the pieces and they are fully integrated to get to the full model. And once it's done, it's done. So that's an example of one of these things. What about something that's inessential, integrated, and determinate? Well, this could be something like a conference website. As we get closer to an annual conference, we start getting information added to the website about transportation, new speakers, last-minute exhibitors, all sorts of things like that. Those are integrated into the website, and sometime after the conference is over, we stop adding to the website. It becomes a historic piece of information, and it might include the slides from a particular presentation that you went to or something like that. But at some point, it has an ending and it's not going to be added to anymore. Essential, integration, and indeterminate. Well, here this could be something like a current online news website. All of these exist because they are putting current news out to you. So if they stop doing that, they stop being quite as significant, except as maybe a historic piece of information. The news is integrated into the website, and all of these places intend to keep doing this forever. Then there's inessential, integration, and indeterminate. Perhaps this is an ongoing wiki or blog. These are intended to go on forever. They integrate into the information that's already there, but if they stop, the previous information still has value. Then we have the essential, succession, and determinant. Here is the dictionary example I alluded to earlier, although thankfully this one is complete. This one was issued in successive parts in over a 2-year period. So it was important to know that it was all going to be there. It was issued in multiple volumes. That means it's in succession mode. And it has an end. Once you have that last entry in Z, you're done. How about inessential succession indeterminate? Well, what about a conference video diary? What occurred to me here was the video testimonials from YLX that were recorded during ALA Midwinter 2016. Each of these were discrete segments that were put together. They had a determined ending because after Midwinter 2016 they weren't added to, and it didn't really matter how many there were from a conceptual standpoint. I'm sure each one of them had deep meaning, and especially for those of you who contributed them or enjoyed them. Now we have the one that is maybe here just because it's part of the model, but a real world thing might not exist. There's a tension here between essential extension of content and succession mode and indeterminate. This would have to be a work that can't be used without having the complete set of supplements, but that has no known termination date. So this may just be a mental construct here. However, if any of you can think of something that falls into this category as a suggestion, please let me know, because I would dearly love to explain a real example of this one. And finally, there's something that's inessential, succession, and indeterminate. And that could be an annual report. The RDA Steering Committee issues these successively every year. They intend to do so until the RSC doesn't exist anymore. And the content is discrete, and it doesn't matter that once the RSC ceases to exist, those old annual reports are still pretty valid for representing what happened in that given year. I'd like to take the rest of the time here to take a bit of a closer look at what's coming with the IFLA Library Reference Model, a few highlights. I think most of you know that this is a consolidation of the separately developed IFLA conceptual models of Ferber, Frad, and Forsad. There are new LRM entities that are being added to RDA, and this is not a complete list, but they include agent, so one or more real human beings. Those agents must be able to do everything a human being can do: publish, create, own. There's collective agent, which is a subclass of agent and a superclass of the RDA entity's corporate body and family. Those entities will continue to exist in the new toolkit, but when those instructions can be generalized to collective agent, they will be. There's nomen, a label or a name for an entity, which is then associated with the entity itself. It is not the entity itself, it is a name for it. There's place, a given extent of space, with a recognition that the boundaries may change over time. And that's true, certainly you can start thinking of countries, large cities, or even small ones. And then there's time span, which is a duration of time, which can be very specific. Even a nanosecond has a duration, or it can be a broad range, such as the Bronze Age, which is both a broad range and a little fuzzy on its boundaries. LRM also has moved more to emphasizing relationships over attributes. And so let's take a little bit of a closer look here. If I wanted to get the publisher's name from this Manual of European Languages for Librarians, I would transcribe it from the manifestation right now. I'd certainly grab Bowker, and I might say something about in association with the London School of Economics. I would do this with or without applying some sort of transcription rules. RDA allowed you to take what you see, so I could take Bowker in all caps, but in almost all cases, I would put this into sentence case and only capitalize the B. But I could also present this as a relationship, and actually right now we can do this, we just generally don't. I could here take the title and then say that it has a publisher's name, and then supply the authorized access point for Bowker at this period in time, which was RR Bowker Company. Or if I'm doing linked data, I could actually have the IRI for that entity. So I could do both. I could do one or both. And we do both of those recording method things all the time. I make notes to justify added entries, for example. There's no reason that you have to be limited to doing just one. And if we think back to the recording methods, transcribing the publisher's name, well, that in and of itself is an unstructured description. Presenting as a relationship, depending on how I do it, might be an authorized access point, or a structured description, it might even be an IRI. Then there are manifestation statements. These are literal transcriptions from the manifestation. So with that same example, if I were being super literal, the manifestation title and responsibility statement would pay attention even to the hard carriage returns in the Manual of European Languages for librarians. Chances are that that white space will be closed up for that purpose. But notice what wouldn't change with that would be the capitalization and the spacing. So I actually would put the space between the initials of C.G. Allen. And if I were really being a literal transcription, I would have put in the credentials of Mr. Allen here in the fine print in the example. So what catalogers do right now, and I expect many of us will continue to do into the future, modified transcription. We applied some sort of transcription rules, and that's really recording rather than transcribing. And in any case, it certainly is not a manifestation statement. So if I were doing this right now, I would apply sentence case to the title, and I would close up those spaces in C.G. Allen's name. Representative expression elements. This is one of the things I alluded to earlier with some things changing where they belong in the LRM model. These are now been identified as certain expression elements that are most closely associated with the original work. And this solves a problem that many of us, I think, had with Ferber and Frad, that textual works, the language lived only at the expression level. And that seems kind of ludicrous because, well, didn't Shakespeare really conceive of Hamlet in English? Having this now as an expression element that can be associated with the work lets us finally make that assertion. And it also lets us say that the medium of performance for Beethoven's Emperor Concerto is piano and orchestra, and the key is E flat major. Those of you familiar with the current toolkit might be saying, wait a minute, medium of performance and key live at the work level. That's true right now, but IFLA LRM moves them to the expression level. So this takes on importance there as well. So we can assert original instrumentation and original key as part of a representative expression element. And now the fun one, the revised entity for person. This is a subclass of LRM's agent and therefore has to be able to do all the things that real human beings can do. This is a significant change from Frad in the model for non-human personages, and one that I know many of you disagree with. It is, however, a model, and the model that we're using, and so we have to try to make that work. So the new scope for person will exclude personas, spirits, fictitious and legendary characters, animal performers, and whatever else you think goes in here. The RSC recognizes the importance of being able to associate the name or nomen with the manifestation where it appears. In this particular example with Geronimo Stilton, one of everyone's favorite examples here, obviously people are looking for this book because of Geronimo Stilton's name. Now, asserting that he's the author doesn't make him a person. It makes him a nomen associated with this particular manifestation. So we have to find a way in our catalogs to allow retrieval on these names without also making an assertion that Geronimo Stilton is a real person. He really is a type of pseudonym. And as with all pseudonyms, sometimes the real human being behind the nomen can be identified, and sometimes it can't. Now, how all this plays out exactly in RDA, and especially in name authority records in the NACO authority file, that is not yet clear. There is possibility that we may not be making substantive changes to our practices, although we may be making changes to relationship designators or introducing new ones to help deal with this situation. This plays out too with animal performers. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Terry, or perhaps Toto. I believe she had a name change after her success in Wizard of Oz. Now, she's not an agent in the movie, but she's certainly doing something, and she's doing it. Her trainer isn't. She has a nomen, and we need to be able to relate that nomen to the manifestation where it is used. We can do that through a manifestation statement or a statement of responsibility. Those would be unstructured descriptions. We could add an access point or a structured description. We might be able to extend the association relationship. This is where some work still needs to be done by the RSC. and that would be part of relationships. I must note this is not about subjects. RDA will continue to retain a very high-level approach with subjects because globally, not everyone agrees about how to deal with subjects or even what the same term means. It also means that RDA will support instructions for constructing subject access for the IFLA LRM entities that are applicable, but it will not go beyond those. So I know there's a lot of discussion on various lists right now about some of these fictitious entities. It is an ongoing problem. If you're interested in more information, I encourage you to visit the following websites. The RDA Toolkit website maintained by ALA Publishing has a 3R project subsection. There have been 3 updates there so far, and the most recent one included some screenshots. Again, sample screenshots from the new toolkit. The RDA Steering Committee has a presentations section on its website. I encourage you to go there. There should be some presentations linked from the Madrid meeting just last month. I'm expecting them to be up in the next week or so. If you have not yet looked at the IFLA Library Reference Model, I encourage you to do so. The August 2017 PDF is the most recent version, and it was fully approved by IFLA in that form. For those of you who work with continuing resources, please keep your eyes open for a forthcoming discussion paper from the ISSN International Center and the RDA Steering Committee about issues on IFLA LRM alignment for serials and other continuing resources. This will further explore the impact of LRM on continuing resources. And depending on the outcomes there and recommendations, this may be something that still could make the toolkit update in June, or it might be something that is considered for post-3R implementation. Although I will soon be taking your questions, if you have other concerns that come up, please don't hesitate to email me and I will do the best to answer your questions. And that goes for if there are any questions I don't get to in the Q&A session that's just about ready to start, I will do my best to answer those offline as well. So now we're ready to take your questions, and I believe Matt's going to join me and pick out the things that have risen to the surface during my presentation.
Thank you, Kathy. That was there's a lot of information in that presentation. We do already have a few questions, and I encourage you all to submit additional questions and comments using the question box. First few we were getting was on citing RDA. Any complex text may need to be cited, and how can we cite RDA instructions without numbers?
Like I said, I have some concerns about the instructions not having numbers, but people who've worked a little more closely with the development find that because it is not as much an ebook form, that it's not so easy to do. I would assume we would have to then name the chapters, the entity chapters or the general guidance chapters specifically. But as I said, I have absolute confidence that as catalogers, we will find shorthand ways to do this if they aren't provided for us.
Great, okay, and let's see here. Got another one here on RDA. My screen's a little small here. This is on terminology in RDA with AACR2. Will there be a better use of legacy terminology for searching? In the current version of RDA, if you look for a term that was used in AACR2 but not RDA, you get no results.
I would expect that situation would continue. There's not going to be a lot of retrospective work done to coordinate the new toolkit with AACR2. One thing I should mention, though, is that where possible, we are expecting to have a instruction number index to the new toolkit. So if you happen to know, you want to look up copyright date and you happen to know the number for that, you would be able to search that in the new toolkit and get to the copyright date instructions. So it's not exactly the terminology issue, but it's sort of related. So, and since I forgot to mention it, now you know.
Great. Here's another one on aggregates. What impact, if any, will the new thinking on aggregates have on the need for formulation of AAPs for works and expressions?
This is one of those things where we really need to figure out what's going on with these aggregates. And part of it is then, as I had in the earlier slide, about when you have a new one and when you don't. RDA has taken a very literal way of distinguishing authorized access points in expressions. And if you read the instructions as they exist right now, they encourage us to make these very clear distinctions. Local implementation, especially through the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, has not taken that to its full end, in part because controlling strings, making them unique, is a very awkward and difficult thing and can lead to some nightmarish situations for those of you who've gone down that rabbit hole. The real answer for this, I think, is the linked data solution. So most of us don't live there, and we will have to find ways to make our data work in the current environment, but with an idea that in the long term, unique authorized access points that are relying on character strings ad infinitum are just not a really useful way to move forward into a new environment.
Thanks. Oh, I just moved my screen funny. Here, let me pull that down. So we have a few on non-humans. If fictitious characters such as Geronimo Stilton aren't allowed to be agents anymore, will existing fictitious character authority records need editing?
It's a really good question, and they'll probably need some form of editing, but in an earlier release of IFLA LRM, there was actually a document that accompanied it that explained some of these differences, and an assertion was made there that we might not have to change our authority record approach to implement this change. So that's really the implementation of this is outside of the scope of RDA and is up to the individual cataloging agencies and policy statements and things like that. But I know people are looking at this with an eye toward what needs to change and what can remain the same and what can we tweak versus what needs massive rethinking. And obviously we're all interested in the tweaking solutions rather than the massive rethinking solutions.
And I think that kind of leads to another question here between tweaking and not. Given some very major changes in the instructions, including new concepts, how is this not a new edition of RDA?
Well, isn't that an interesting question? I certainly think it needs to be marketed as something quite different than what we have now. But the end result is that everything, the goal that the RSC stated at the onset of the 3R project was that essentially that everything you do now you can do in the future. Now, obviously with the person thing, there are a few exceptions, but generally speaking, our goal was to make a better toolkit user experience without significantly impacting the results of applying the instructions. And that's the viewpoint that makes it not a new edition or a new expression of RDA.
Just another note from an attendee. The Madrid presentations have been posted to the RSC website, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
There's a few on RDA and MARC here. RDA to MARC mappings have been really helpful when working with legacy data. Will those still be available, and how will they work without instruction numbers?
That's a great question. I believe the RSC is still willing to support some form of the MARC mappings. I can tell you that the technical work that has to go on behind that to make that work has been extremely difficult, and we're grateful to the people who have been working on that. I believe both the Brits and the Canadians have been doing extensive work to make that function. I suspect how that would work then would have to be linked somehow out of the entity instructions themselves, but I have not seen, I don't believe I've seen a mock-up for that, and that's a really valid question.
And actually, I think this question might dovetail to that one. Will examples in the toolkit include subfield codes, or will we still have to go to the MARC 21?
So the examples, as I understand them, are planned to follow those 4 different recording methods. And RDA is not tied to MARC. There was a very intentional move. In fact, it's not tied to ISBD. There was an intentional move in the RDA examples originally to start breaking away from some of the apparent endorsement of just a single approach So there's some ISBD examples in the current toolkit, but I don't believe they're all that way. And there needs to be more movement that way. RDA wants to offer a lot of flexibility. So I don't think that the mark tagging itself will be part of the examples, because that ties RDA to a particular standard where we want to be global. So they might need to reside in local policy statements instead.
Okay. Oh, here's one. Is the verbiage related to diachronic works going to supplement the verbiage related to continuing resources?
I think so. And this is something that was really just introduced for the RSC at the Madrid meeting. So I don't have a lot of experience with diachronic work stuff yet. But yes, it will be part of the whole look at that joint paper that will be coming from the ISSN International Center, and the RSC will be looking at all of those issues. And whether all of the terminology changes or only some of it, I'm not yet clear.
And let's see here. Why would RDA choose to use the term provenance when that term is such an important one in the archives part of our community? It seems like it's asking for more confusion.
You know, I personally raised this issue and I was overruled, so I tried. It's because it's looking toward a broader application, and if we need to make that distinction, I think it will be easier to emphasize the custodial history aspects of what archivists now think of as provenance, and let the linked data version, and you can go on the web and look up linked data definitions of provenance, and it really has this much broader meaning. I had suggested some other terms, they haven't flown, so it is just one of those sometimes you win and sometimes you don't situations.
Okay, well, we have time for one more question. Let me just see what we have coming in. We have a few more unanswered that I'll send to you, and we can get out to everyone.
Great, thanks.
Will there be a keyword index to the new toolkit, and how about searching capability as there is now?
All of the searching capability that you've come to expect will still be functional in a web environment. I didn't include any screenshots for that, and I haven't looked too closely at it myself. Right now, this is difficult for the RSC to play around with because there's just sample content and not functional content in there. So my understanding is yes, absolutely, we need you to be able to navigate as many ways as possible through searching, through drop-down menus. So I would expect all the functionality and hopefully more than you have right now.
Great. So that concludes the Q&A. Waiting for. So we are glad you could be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALEX Continuing Education Committee plan future events. Thanks to Felicity Dicus and Joseph Oliveras of the ALEX Continuing Education Committee, and to Megan Doherty and Jasly Cooley of the ALEX Office for technical support. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. The final webinar of the fall will be December 6th, NACO Authority Control Identity Management, Evolving Strategies for a Changing Names Authority Landscape. This concludes our session. Thank you for joining us.